So today, what I'm going to talk about, the title on the slide, is, I guess, what I think is, to a lot of people, it's probably going to sound slightly esoteric. I know most people haven't heard of this kind of bioeconomy. And I don't know, it's one of these things that's interested me for some time. I'm not really sure why, but it's been a long-standing research interest of mine. This idea of the bioeconomy, this notion of the bioeconomy. So I'm going to try and explain what it is, why it might be important, how we can understand it, what its implications are, and so on today. If there is at any point in time, if there is anything you want me to clarify, then please do, because you may not realize that something is not obvious. Okay. So this is just to give you a series of topics that I'm going to talk about rather than give you a kind of overview slide. So I'm going to talk about climate change, Canada and climate change, biofuels, and then the bioeconomy at the end. So I'll start with climate change. This is the kind of big overarching why. Why am I interested in this bioeconomy? Why am I interested in biofuels and so on? So I see climate change as essentially the kind of main danger facing humanity, in a sense, right now. And I'm emphasizing humanity. The planet, I can think the planet can look after itself. It's us that we're the ones that are going to suffer with climate change. And I think Bill McKinnon has a good article in Rolling Stone in which he outlines some of the kind of scariness of climate change and the impending scariness of climate change. And he does this by talking through three, what he calls kind of scary or terrifying maths. So scary numbers, three scary numbers that he highlights. 2 degrees Celsius, 565 gigatons of CO2 emissions, and then 2,795 gigatons of CO2 emissions. And so his argument is that 2 degrees Celsius, that's the kind of general, if we get below that over the next sort of century, if our global temperature rises are below that, then we should be okay. If we're above that, then we're really entering, that's danger zone, if you like. Now, in order to meet that 2 degrees Celsius, we have to not, we have to basically stop CO2 emissions. And we've only got 565 gigatons of CO2 emissions left until we hit the 2 degrees Celsius. And we're already pretty close to 565 gigatons. We're about 13 years away, according to Bill McKinnon's maths, because we're releasing about 30 gigatons a year. Now, the real problem, the real scary number is that last number, the 2,795 gigatons. That's the amount of CO2 emissions that are in the world's known and calculated fossil fuel reserves. So those are the fossil fuel reserves that are factored into the share values of companies, factored into the kind of assets of governments or of state-owned enterprises, and so this is the carbon that has already been accounted for and it was effectively already being used based upon the kind of economic calculations. So according to, just to quote Bill McKinnon, just to make it slightly clearer than probably I've done there, he says, this coal and gas and oil is still technically in the soil at the minute, but it's already economically above ground. It's figured into share prices, companies are borrowing money against it, nations are basing their budgets on the presumed returns from their patrimony. So in a sense, we're going to see this release of nearly 3,000 gigatons unless we wipe out the value of all those assets. And that the value of all those assets is around $20 trillion of those fossil fuel assets. So that's kind of scary numbers. And so there's a movement for divestment from fossil fuel companies. There's an organization called 350.org that Bill McKinnon set up. There are various students campaigning for their universities to divest. There are pension funds, people campaigning for their pension funds to divest. And there's a whole notion of this kind of unburnable carbon, these nearly 3,000 gigatons that we can't use anymore. So that's kind of scary starting point. Now, Canada. Now, these two graphs, these to illustrate on the left-hand side, this is Canada's energy consumption. On the right-hand side, this is Canada's GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. So how much energy does Canada use? How many GHGs does Canada release? We can see on the left-hand side, we can see rising consumption of energy, including fossil fuels. Some of these are predictions past that line around about 2010. And we can see rising use of fossil fuels continuing. We're going to keep on using fossil fuels.
What are GHGs?
Oh, greenhouse gases, sorry. Yeah. So greenhouse gases are GHGs. Yeah. So we have a very small, in Canada, there's a very small amount of renewables in the kind of energy mix. Where it is most obvious is in electricity, but even in electricity generation, it's still pretty small. So renewables are a very small component of this energy consumption.
Could you explain that one?
Yeah, so I'll just come to this one now. So this is the GHGs. Can we turn a light off at the front here, or is that possible, or maybe? Oh, is it? Because I don't know if that's particularly clear. So this is GHGs, and I think it's an index to 1990. So this is 1990 there. That's better, right? So it's indexed to 1990. So we're all supposed to, every country is supposed to go back to 1990 levels by whatever date, according to the Kyoto protocols. So it's indexed to 1990 being 100, and we can see that Canada has rising levels of GHGs after that. So it's not reducing the amount that it's emitting up until about 2008. What happened in 2008? Great. Crisis, global financial crisis. So the recession was really good for reducing our emissions, basically. The orange line that's GHGs emitted per GDP. So that's the kind of accounting of relative GHG emissions. So that means that production is getting more efficient, where we're producing fewer emissions over time through production. So that's pretty good. But the other one is just not, it's not really coming down. The only reason it came down is because of the global financial crisis. So that's not good. So Canada is currently around about, I think it's 700 million tons of GHG emissions a year. I think it's about that. And it's not going down, basically. If anything, it'll continue going up because we'll continue using all this energy and so on. So this is the kind of context that the context in Canada, if you like. So just to give you some takeaway points. There's not really, as you can see from both graphs, there's not really a political will in Canada to reduce total energy consumption or to reduce GHG emissions. And I'm not just talking about Harper. We all know about Harper. I'm also talking about, there's all political parties. There's all political parties, all groups, social groups, everyone in society. But there's no real will to reduce energy consumption and emissions. We're getting much more efficient, and that's the sort of declining amount of GHGs per GDP produced, but we're not reducing the absolute amount, and that's the important thing, is to reduce the absolute amount. So in some senses, this might look like an intractable problem, but is it? Is it an intractable problem? And it's not necessarily, depending on your perspective, but we can kind of burrow down a bit into the data to kind of identify some of the kind of underlying problems in Canada. This graph is a graph of GHG emissions per sector over time from 1990 to 2012. And you can see that the two main and rising sources of GHG emissions over time are the oil and gas sector and transportation sector. So oil and gas is at the top there. That's risen by about 73%. Transportation has risen, I think at a rough calculation, about 30% in that 22-year period. The other kinds of sectors, some have dropped their GHG emissions, so electricity generation industries, and again they've dropped at exactly that point in time, 2009 I think they dropped as a consequence of the global financial crisis, and then some stayed the same, so building, agriculture, waste I think all stay the same. So
Can you just clarify that oil and gas, is that just production?
I think it is, yes. That's my sense is just production. So it's, it's tar sands, basically. So those are the two areas: oil and gas, production, and transportation. So if you think about it, those are the kind of two main areas where emissions are getting higher and emissions are already high. So if we could find some way of dealing with that, wouldn't that be fantastic? So we need to find a new source of energy for transport, because that takes care of oil for petrol, sorry, gas. I'm British, so when I have to say petrol, because if I say gas, what I mean by gas is natural gas. So whenever, so I say petrol instead of gas, if that's going to confuse you more. So we need to find a new source of energy for transport, because that will take care of oil and gas, because we no longer need to use oil and gas for our cars, and also transport, because then hopefully we can get a much more, sustainable form of energy for transport. And this then brings us to the controversial topic of liquid transport biofuels. And this is basically about trying to find an alternative to fossil fuels for transport. And so we can try and deal with those two issues of oil and gas and transport, the GHG emissions. And there's been an increasing amount of support over time, over the recent years, for biofuels across and around the world. Some countries got in very early, like Brazil, other countries much more recently, like the US, European Union, and so on. Now, liquid biofuels, just to give you some background, just so that you know what I'm talking about, there's two main types of liquid biofuels at the minute. They're known as first generation biofuels because they're the first kind of type, and they're based upon food crops, basically. So there's ethanol, which is derived from sugar crops, so sugarcane, and also starch crops like corn and wheat. And this is the kind of most common kind of biofuel, if you like. And then there are biodiesel fuels, which are derived from oily crops, things like canola, jatropha, soy, and so on. This graph just illustrates the kind of growth of production and consumption of biofuels in general over the period between 2007 and 2011. So by biofuels, I assume what they're doing is they're talking about both ethanol and biodiesel. So what you can see here, in a pretty short period of time, 2007, 2011, in space of 4 years, you've got a doubling of the production of biofuels in the US, and an almost doubling of consumption. What you've also got is in Europe, you've got an almost doubling of production and consumption, and in the whole world, you've got an almost doubling. So in a very 4 years, you've got a pretty large expansion of biofuels around the world. Now, it's important to know that biofuels are, they're very different. Not all biofuels are the same. So ethanol, for example, and ethanol made from sugar is very different from ethanol made from corn, made from wheat, and they're different from biodiesel. So things like ethanol made from sugar, which is the primary product of Brazil, is much cheaper to make or to produce than is ethanol made from corn, which is the primary product of the US. So there's they have very different kinds of economics behind them, very different kinds of, I guess, materialities, if we want. Now, the next phase of biofuels, the next phase that everyone's kind of pinning their hopes on, are so-called advanced biofuels, second-generation biofuels. And these comprise much more technically complex forms of, fuels based on non-food crops. So it's about moving away from first-generation food crop biofuels to second-generation non-food crop biofuels. And these will be based on sort of idea being they'll be based on agricultural residues, they'll be based on the non-food crops like switchgrass or miscanthus, they'll be based upon waste, they'll be based upon even upon things like wood. So as long as you can break down the cellulose in all those kinds of feedstocks, then you can create the sugars which you can turn into ethanol. And there are various technical ways of doing this. At the minute, these second-generation advanced biofuels are just not economical at a large scale. Now, this all sounds, it all sounds, to some people this sounds great. You can create these biofuels, you can replace oil and gas, you can have much more supposedly sustainable fuels in your cars and so on. You can resequester the CO2 that you release through burning these biofuels by growing more of them, and all these sorts of things that sound fantastic. But you come up against a major environmental natural limit. And you can only grow so much food, or so many crops. You can only grow so many crops because you need to grow food, and you've only got so much cropland and so on and so forth. So there's a real issue with the amount of feedstocks you can actually grow in order to produce the biofuels in order to replace the petrol, the petroleum, the oil. So just to give you some more takeaways, there's been a significant push behind biofuels, expanding biofuels in the last few years. There are problems, and I'll go into some of the real problems in a second. And this push behind biofuels is not just it's not just short-term, it also has long-term policy drivers. But there's also a more recent push behind advanced biofuels to replace these problematic first-generation ones. And just to give you, some of you may remember these kinds of controversies about biofuels. Someone kindly, before the talk this week, kindly sent me their take on it after emailing Meta about the talk. It's become particularly evident that there are a series of problems with first-generation biofuels based on food crops, so corn, wheat, so on, sugar. In particular, these controversies erupted in 2007 and 8 with the rising food prices and the food riots that resulted. And so you can see this kind of, you can see this growth of food prices in this graph on the right-hand side. And this is a problem. It's a significant problem because of significant issues with food security as a consequence of food prices. There is an alternatives perspective. You can ask me about the alternatives perspective at the end if you're wanting questions. One of the key issues with with biofuels, this food prices rising, and all these sorts of things, and with the questioning of their sustainability, is the issue of land use. So this became a big issue in 2008 as a consequence of a couple of scientific, or more than that, but the two major scientific papers in Science that questioned the sustainability, the reduction of GHGs as a consequence of using biofuels. And they did this by questioning, by highlighting the indirect land use consequences of shifting towards biofuels. So if we start planting crops for biofuels, that means that we have to find more space to grow the crops that we feed our animals or we feed ourselves. So even if you're not directly shifting crops around, the consequences of growing biofuels are that you end up having to cut down more trees to grow more, to create more land for crops or for animals and so on. So this led to an increasing focus on the kind of life cycle of biofuels, of not only thinking about, not only having this kind of rosy tinted spectacles about them, but also thinking about the kind of GHGs that get released throughout the life cycle from their growth to their eventual burning. So what's the consequences, for example, of cutting down trees to grow more crops for cows that have been displaced by using biofuels somewhere else?
So you may say it's related to lifestyle.
Lifestyle.
Of people.
Oh yeah, it's totally. Yeah, I'll get to some of that stuff later. Yeah, it's totally related to lifestyle. So that's another issue. This whole idea of indirect of land use change and so on. Another kind of controversy around biofuels is the issue of related to land use is this issue of whether they actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions at all. And so this graph on the right-hand side is a series of studies which calculate the kind of GHG reductions of various biofuels against petrol. And so it shows that, I'm going to ignore diesel, which is biodiesel, which is on the right-hand side, and just focus on ethanol. So it shows that sugarcane is pretty good at reducing GHG emissions. That's the one on the far left side. Then you've got wheat. Wheat is very variable. Corn is even worse. And the lignocellulose, that's the kind of advanced second generation stuff, is that's again variable, but it looks better. So what we're looking at is corn, the US's main biofuel crop, wheat, and that's the Canadian main crop, are not very good, or at least they're highly variable when it comes to reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're not exactly, biofuels aren't exactly, by definition, they're not exactly sustainable.
You have two columns with lignocellulose.
Yeah, so that on the left-hand side, that's ethanol.
No, the lignocellulose, that's
Yeah.
this one, and there's
And there's that one.
there.
Yeah, so this is the ethanol lignocellulose,
Oh,
and I think that's the biodiesel lignocellulose.
okay.
Okay, so so all that on that side is ethanol. All this on this side is biodiesel. So different kinds of crops.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what they put in the lignocellulose for biodiesel, because I don't know. That doesn't necessarily make sense. But yeah. Okay. So that's another kind of issue. So this leads to this search for sustainable biofuels. So we have a massive expansion of, this is really probably quite difficult to read, isn't it? But a massive expansion of certification schemes, standards, initiatives, all these sorts of attempts to create criteria for sustainable biofuels and to promote those criteria so that we end up with biofuels that are good for the planet rather than biofuels that are bad for the planet, very crudely. So some of these criteria cover things like biodiversity impacts. You know, you have to, when you're growing biofuels, you have to take account of biodiversity impacts. If you have a negative impact on biodiversity, then your crop's not going to get certification. The same with things like land use, socialist use, labour rights, all these sorts of things. So there's a series of criteria that each of these certification schemes has, and they're all different, that if you don't match them, you can't get certified. And so you can't get certified as sustainable biofuels, basically. Okay. So there's a number of issues with this whole certification system that I won't go into, but the main one being it's incredibly complex, and essentially it means that if you're a small producer, small operator, it's going to be you're not going to be able to navigate your way around this economically or practically, in a sense. It's going to be very costly if you're a small producer to make sure you've got all the certification, and therefore it has a tendency to drive producers towards centralizing to large operations and so on. They're the ones that benefit most from this kind of scheme. And this is just a another way of illustrating these kinds of problems with the sustainability of biofuels, showing some of the problems that certain crops have, certain kinds of biofuel crops have. So, for example, corn, I don't think it's very good with greenhouse gas emissions. It's not very good with water, fertilizers, pesticide, energy. And if you wanted to meet half of the US demand, you'd have to have between 157% and 262% of the US cropland to do that. So it's not very good as a biofuel. But yet it is the main biofuel crop in the US. And so you've got other ones. Sugarcane comes out a bit better, and so on and so forth. But you can see that it's incredibly difficult to meet, to basically supply the full kind of needs for transport in the US with these various crops. Sure.
What I see up there, I think what is appealing is that the one that says uses timber waste and other debris.
Yep.
Because at least as I read that, I may be, misreading it, but that seems to be the only one that is, using waste and debris. The other things are, planted specifically for the purpose of creating the biofuel.
Sure. So yeah, so that's wood residue. So that's the kind of cellulosic second generation biofuel that people can do, but it's just not economical right now. So it's kind of that's the one that a lot of people in a lot of companies, I think, in Canada are focusing on, because obviously Canada's got lots of wood, So it makes sense to develop your cellulosic ethanol from that kind of wood residue mass and so on.
No, I don't travel as much in northern Ontario as I
Right.
used to. But when my parents would take me there in the past, I would see these huge sawdust burners.
Mm.
If they're still doing that, that would be a
That's
example.
precisely, yeah. Sawdust, wood chip, roadside residues from timber cutting, all these sorts of things. If you could collect all that material, bring it to a central place, process it, turn it into a fuel. Yeah, that's the kind of that's some of the ideal kind of plans that people have. Yeah, in Canada. Yeah.
Algae looks terrific.
Yes, it does. Incredibly expensive to do. So, yeah. So it says here potentially huge production levels. Technology not ready. It's not. It looks fantastic. Algae. There's also synthetic biology. It looks fantastic. You've got these very new kinds of technological solutions. They're just not. You can't scale them up because it's too expensive at the minute. So they might come down, and that's still the problem with the cellulosic second generation stuff around wood, is it's expensive to scale up and so on at the minute. Now there's a catch-22 involved in that no one's going to invest in this technology to scale up because they don't know what the returns are going to be, and they don't seem to be high, and that means that you can't then develop your technology to scale up to make it more efficient because no one's going to give you the money. So you're kind of caught in that catch-22 in that situation.
Does that mean you could grow the algae in something like a lagoon or something?
I think the idea is that you'd grow it in like a factory. It would be like a kind of pond factory or something where you grow it. Yeah, but it still takes up. It'll still require a lot of land area to do. But
I see the potential for huge production level. Technology not ready.
yes, yeah.
But you just mentioned about the sawdust piling up.
Yeah.
But there's if you use the sawdust, and you can create the energy to run the sawmill.
Well, I know.
Oh yeah.
I know this is a big.
This is part of the bioeconomy. This is what we come back. Yeah. So this is part of the
I agree
of the cycle.
With what you're saying, that if every sawdust burner is a sign of failure. I mean, and it's a sign of waste. They pollute too. They always smoke from them.
But yeah. Okay. So I'm aware of time. So I just think I need to kind of rush through probably the next slide. This slide, and why do people still promote biofuels if there are all these problems, these controversies with them? And a lot of it is to do with first of all, what makes them attractive is, first of all, there are technical issues, there are technical aspects of them that make them attractive. You don't have to change our existing infrastructure. Yeah, we can keep our cars, we can keep our petrol stations, distribution stations. We just need to maybe retrofit some of the stuff, but we can keep it. We can substitute biofuels for fossil fuels, and that makes them, that makes it much cheaper. There's a kind of economic push as well. There's some people reason that we need to promote these first generation feedstock-based biofuels in order to create a market for the second generation, more advanced ones. And if we don't create that market, there'll be no incentive to develop the second generation ones. So we need to suffer a little bit now in order to create that, that market. And there are a range of different kind of policy drivers as well. They differ between countries, but you can generally identify about 3 main policy drivers. And they're pretty long-standing policy drivers that go back several decades, 2 or 3 decades. And these are economic growth, especially in rural areas, so economic development in rural areas, energy security, so we don't have to rely on overseas oil anymore. That's especially important in the US. And then sustainability, GHG reduction, savings, and all that sort of thing. So those are the kind of 3 kind of making key policy drivers. And you can see them. You can see the evolution of these policy drivers through the various policies that are being enacted in different countries. And I just highlighted a few here from the European Union and the United States. But I will skip over them in a sense. Okay. So, you know, so the starting point was climate change. Climate change is a real, you know, significant threat. You know, one possibility was using biofuels to replace fossil fuels. You know, it doesn't seem to actually be the, you know, the answer to our problem in a sense. So what, you know, what is the are there any other answers out there? And there's been a lot of faith, as I mentioned, pinned on sort of advanced biofuels, the cellulosic, the algae, the synthetic biology, and so on. But none of it's economical yet. None of it's been, you know, none of it can compete with oil. That's what they mean by economical. You can make it, but it can't compete with oil, so no one's going to buy it. So, key problem is, part of the key problem is that similar to oil with petrol, so similar to that, petrol is a kind of high volume, but actually quite a low cost or low value kind of product. And there's a similar issue with biofuels in the sense that it's a high volume, but actually quite a low value product. And so you need to find out some sort of way of combining the production of, you know, that high volume but low value product, biofuels, with something else. And the petroleum industry does it by producing a lot of high value end products like chemicals, plastics, you know, all these sorts of things. And so part of the rationale behind, part of the rationale behind this promotion of what I'm going to talk about, this bioeconomy, is trying to find a way of combining the production of biofuels with these other kinds of products, these co-products and byproducts. And I'll talk through this now. So just to kind of introduce you to this can I use a mouse or something to, or do I have to press on the screen? Yep. So this? Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm just going to introduce you to the bioeconomy by giving you, it's a 2-minute, I think it's a 2-minute piece of European propaganda. But it will give you a kind of sense of what the bioeconomy is. Or maybe it won't. Okay. I thought I'd embedded this correctly, but maybe not. Okay, maybe. Could do, but I could just skip over it. Okay, you don't need to see propaganda. So basically, the propaganda is telling you that the bioeconomy, this notion of the bioeconomy, this new concept of, you know, an economy based on biological materials, underpinned by biological materials rather than fossil fuels, is going to, you know, it's a win-win. Basically, it's going to lead to economic growth, and it's going to lead to more jobs, and it's going to lead to lower GHG emissions. It's going to be much more sustainable. All these sorts of things. And I've actually brought some props. So we're going to be able to create, you know, products like spoons from compostable materials. So, you know, from wood products, from wood, and that means that we can just, you know, we can put them in the compost, and they can biodegrade and all these sorts of things. The same with pens. We can produce pens from the same kind of compostable materials. Maybe you've noticed Coke's Dasani bottle has a little friendly recycling symbol on it, where they have they're calling it a plant bottle, as in, you know, the green plant, and it says it's, you know, 30% made from plant-based materials. So we already have these kinds of materials around us, these kind of compostable plant-based materials, and these comprise part of this notion of the bioeconomy. So these two pictures give you a kind of sense of what people are getting at when they talk about the bioeconomy. So on the left-hand side, we have the bioeconomy. They're talking about the extraction of natural resources, the turning of those natural resources into products, into fuels, into energy to fuel the refinery itself, so that it's all, you know, there's no waste, basically. And then you have the products go out into, you know, out into the market, get sold, get used, and then they're all compostable, so they can all go back into the ground and be composted at the end, or they can be burned and used for heating or electricity or whatever. So you have this kind of nice cycle. The bioeconomy is this kind of, it's presented as this nice cycle. Take resources, turn them into things, fuel, byproducts, co-products, use them, and then return them to the, you know, to the earth, if if you like. And so what you're doing in terms of the bioeconomy is there's this another concept called the biorefinery, which is this idea of where you're actually doing all this activity is in a, it's basically in a factory, a refinery, which comprises, you put in the inputs, could be wood, could be, other kinds of biological material. From that you create biofuels, hopefully second generation biofuels. You create bioplastics, you create biomaterials, you create biochemicals, all these things alongside creating biofuels. And then you have waste that comes out of it. You use that, you burn it in your biorefinery to power your refinery, to light it and to power the production process, all these sorts of things. And it's it's an internal kind of system. And then you have the products come out at the end. They're all compostable, they're all plant-based, they're all natural, sustainable, and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of bioeconomy notion, basically. So you replace the fossil fuel inputs, gas, oil, and so on, and you replace the fossil fuel outputs. Basically, you have these biological, bio-based products as the outputs, and you use biological materials as the inputs. And so what you're doing is you're essentially restructuring the whole economy by replacing fossil fuels with biological materials as the inputs and the kind of products that you come out with, and the energy that you use. So, a lot of this will obviously involve new kinds of research, development, innovation, all these sorts of things. So there's a lot of this will involve quite high-tech, a quite high-tech kind of vision, if you like. So we need to rethink the way we do things, the processes we use to make products, all these sorts of things. But at the same time, it's underpinned by the use of biomass, biological matter, trees, plants, all these sorts of things. That is, it sounds kind of old-fashioned, even possibly. And so what it does, this notion of the bioeconomy, is it's a very attractive notion because it means we don't actually have to totally change our way of life. We don't have to totally change our consumption patterns. We don't have to totally change, our economies. We don't have to totally change anything. What we can do is we can simply substitute biological materials for fossil materials, fossil fuel materials, and then we can, at the end, we get out of it compostable bioproducts that are, much more sustainable than the fossil fuel equivalents. So we don't have to change infrastructure, we don't have to change our institutions, we don't have to change our value chains very much, we don't have to change our societal expectations, which goes back to lifestyle, consumption, all these sorts of things. And just to give you a slight digression, a lot of this is based on, a lot of these kinds of ideas, I already mentioned it when it was with biofuels, are based on a kind of notion of life cycle, a life cycle perspective. We have to think, much broader when we're thinking about our economies and our societies. So you have to think about the whole, circular life cycle of things. And this comes across, this whole notion of, thinking about the kind of life cycle of things comes across a lot in a lot of the academic and policy literature, where you have an enormous number of these kinds of fancy diagrams illustrating the kind of different relationships between things. And this is just kind of a way of visually showing you some of these I guess these representations of the bioeconomy. So we have a kind of technical one at the top left, where you have all these different technical processes. Then you have a more kind of social one at the top right, where you have the various social actors that are going to be involved. It'll be universities, refineries, and so on. And then the bottom right left, you've got all the various products that are going to be produced. You've got biofuels, you've got biochemicals, all these sorts of things, energy, and so on. And then here, bottom right, you've got kind of the sustainability aspect of things. You're not going to use as much fossil fuel energy. You're not going to release as many GHG emissions, all these sorts of things. And you can visualize it like this. How many of you actually heard of the bioeconomy before coming here? Okay, three of you. Okay, 4. Sorry. So the bioeconomy is now a major policy strategy across, well, major maybe overselling it a little bit. It's a policy strategy across a number of countries. A number of countries have adopted bioeconomy strategies and are reorientating their policies, a significant number of their policies around promoting this notion of the bioeconomy. And you have, for example, you have the European Union producing a report in a strategy in 2012 called Innovating for Sustainable Growth, the Bioeconomy for Europe. Same year, you have the National Bioeconomy Blueprint produced by the White House. Mid-2000s, you had the OECD producing several, pushing quite strongly behind this notion of the bioeconomy, producing several kind of strategies. And 2008-9, you have Canada producing a strategy which is called, and I love this because I don't know what it quite means, but it's called Beyond Moose and Mountains, and that's the title of the bioeconomy strategy in Canada. Now, interestingly, the Canadian one is produced by a private sector organisation, a trade association. The others are produced by government. So the Canadian government has not been involved in producing. It's not just. It's also before Harper as well. So some of this stuff is. It's just there's maybe a lack of coordination, but it's yeah. So just to give you some sort of sense of how these various strategies represent the bioeconomy, we can see the OECD talks about the latent value of biological products and processes, and this is manifested through product markets. And there's a beautiful sentence here. It says, the benefits are manifest through product markets, through productivity gains in agriculture and health, enhancement effects, health and nutrition, and substitution effects, environment and industrial uses, as well as energy. That kind of represents, that's a really good way of representing the way these policymakers think about the bioeconomy. When it comes to the European Commission, the European Union, they define it slightly differently. They define it as a sustainable use of renewable biological resources. And it's manifesting in terms of innovation, low emissions economy, and so on. And then there's the US has this notion of harnessing biological research and innovation. So it's kind of high-tech vision in order to ameliorate national challenges, health, environmental challenges, and so on. And then Canada, it's based on this notion of biological tools and products, and so on.
You can Google to Canadian Blueprint. You can see that they have a website.
You can find it on the web. It's slightly difficult to find, but you can find it if you use that title. But if you wanted to email me, you could email Meta and email me, and then I can email you a copy. I think I've got a copy downloaded. Yeah, if you wanted it. But you should be able to find it if you just Googled Canadian Blueprint, but it'll be on Moose and Mountains. But I remember it being slightly difficult to get hold of. So that was four different strategies. This is a range of other countries that also have bioeconomy strategies. And this was produced by the Bioeconomy Council, which is a German, I think it's a German agency set up by one of their ministries. And so a lot of countries have, the bioeconomy strategies now. Some are a bit incongruous, I think, because some of them, I find the Canadian one a bit incongruous, considering how much of Canada's economy is based on the extraction of, natural resources. Non-renewable natural resources. But Australia's also got one, in Russia as well, and they're kind of, again, similar kinds of economies. But you notice they're all over the place now. So Japan has one, China has one, India has one, South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, North America, and then Europe. There's quite a few in Europe. So coming to Canada's bioeconomy. So this comes from some current research that I'm doing. So it's a project that I got some money from SHERC to study the Canadian bioeconomy. And what I'm doing with a graduate student called Emily Simmons, who is talking, I think, next week, 2 weeks' time. So she's talking here at Science for Peace in 2 weeks' time, not on this, but on her own research. But we're looking at the kind of discourse around the Canadian bioeconomy, and so we're interviewing various stakeholders, Canadian stakeholders, and we're doing an discourse analysis of various kinds of policy literature. And this is just some examples of the policy literature. And so we have the Moose and Mountain blueprint over on the left-hand side, we have a kind of round table in the middle. On the right-hand side, we have the Forest Products Association, Trade Association. They've got a bioeconomy or biorefinery development, I think that one is, reports. Then the Canadian Renewable Fuels Association this year recently produced this report from biofuels to bioeconomy. So it's this kind of transition from just focusing on biofuels to, to the emphasis on the bioeconomy, called Evolution and Growth. And then down here is a really interesting one. Sorry, my daughter's at the back there. The bottom left is a really interesting one. This is called Establishing the Socio-Political Legitimacy of Canada's Emerging Bioeconomy. How do we make the bioeconomy legitimate in Canada? Yeah, and it's a really interesting PowerPoint presentation by Mary Wellish, who is I can't remember where she works, but she's in some ministry somewhere. But it's really interesting because it's kind of she's kind of doing a kind of discourse analysis herself on how we go about understanding the political legitimacy of something like this bioeconomy. So from the interviews that I've been doing and the kind of the analysis of these documents, we're asking people, what is the bioeconomy? And what comes back to us is the definition of the bioeconomy is it's complex and it's contradictory, and there's all sorts of different kinds of ways of representing it. So it's been represented as the use of biomaterials to make products, sustainable, the production of sustainable products and energy, the substitution of biological materials for fossil fuels. Substitution is a very interesting kind of term that comes up again and again. Frequently, though, there's an agreement that it's not about replacing fossil fuels altogether, because there's an acknowledgement that you can't replace fossil fuels in a sense. There's just not enough land to grow all the crops or all the plants and stuff that you need for the bioeconomy, so you can't actually replace fossil fuels. But there's an emphasis on the bioeconomy being about lowering carbon footprints, as long as you produce biomass sustainably. There's an emphasis on the importance of co-products, so these bioplastics, biomaterials, all these sorts of things, biochemicals, solvents, and so on and so forth, alongside the fuels. There's also a kind of focus on the bioeconomy being about slotting in these various inputs or products into the existing overall political economy. It's not about shifting the political economy. It's about replacing fossil fuel inputs, again, with these biological inputs, and having products that come out at the end that are biological or bio-based products, but aren't, they're not causing a significant shift necessarily. Now, policy in Canada, from talking to people, from this kind of analysis, policy in Canada around the bioeconomy is incredibly fragmented. It's not coordinated like other countries. It's actually fairly siloed, if you like. So different sectors have their different perspectives, different ministries, at the federal level, the provincial level have different perspectives, and there's no kind of overall coordination. There seems to be an attempt to start that coordination, and a lot of it seems to be driven by the private sector, but it will, it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of it. Okay. So, is the bioeconomy the answer to the kind of this question of climate change and the issues that climate change raises for us? And obviously, it depends on your perspective. We can have what I'm calling fairly uncritical perspectives, the ones that are kind of represented by some of those policy strategies, where they have these visions of sustainable biofuels and products being sustainable because they're biological and renewable and so on and so forth. Creation of new kinds of products, new kinds of processes that are all just going to be fancy and they're going to resolve all our problems. But then slightly unrealistic in a sense. They're the ones that I'm calling kind of neutral perspectives, and they're kind of just kind of definitional issues. People trying to define the bioeconomy, what the bioeconomy means, and so on. And they're kind of, it's a little bit, you can't really get a sense of whether the bioeconomy is actually the answer that we're looking for, as it were, from those. And then there are the more critical perspectives. A lot of academics, NGOs, and so on, other kinds of stakeholders that have been very critical of biofuels in the past and have also been critical of the bioeconomy. The bioeconomy is a strategy, the bioeconomy is a kind of a vision of the future. And their starting point is, what are these strategies, these bioeconomy strategies about? What are they meant to do? What kind of policies are they trying to engender and so on? And a lot of them focus on the notion that these strategies are kind of anticipatory or performative discourses that are trying to promote particular policies and particular ways of addressing societal problems that then sideline other kinds of ways of addressing those problems. And so a lot of this critical analysis of the bioeconomy takes this kind of perspective. I'm just going to finish then with a few kind of other concerns, kind of points that I think are worth kind of thinking about. And they're less theoretical, they're more kind of general issues. When it comes to the bioeconomy, thinking about it as a kind of solution to climate change, one of the key issues is the economics of it all, right? So we can make anything we want from any kind of biomass. It's just the scaling it up and the cost of then selling it. So we can make cellulosic biofuels, but it just costs a lot more than petrol, and so no one's going to buy it unless you force them to. And as I said, there's a kind of catch-22 here where there's no one's going to put any investment in these kinds of things because there's an uncertain future. The uncertain future is because there's no investment to reduce the costs, so you're kind of caught in that catch-22. Consumption is frequently ignored in the strategies, the bioeconomy strategies. We have a real issue in Canadian society, in North American society, in European society, Western European society. Real issue with consumption, levels of consumption, right? So not everyone in the world can have our lifestyles. We can't actually afford to have our lifestyles. So we have to think about how do we change our our lifestyles and our patterns of consumption and so on and so forth. Simply substituting a biological material for fossil fuel material doesn't solve that. So we have to really be really critical about addressing our own kinds of expectations of life and so on. There's a threat that pursuing this bioeconomy then will lock us into certain kinds of social, technical expectations. So in terms of social expectations, this goes back to our consumption patterns, lifestyle, and so on. If we simply replace fossil fuels with bio-based materials and so on, we're not challenging the way we live. We're not challenging driving everywhere, living in the suburbs, having a flat screen TV in every room, all these sorts of things. There also, again, this is tied into the technical in the sense that we're not challenging cars, problems with public transit, our energy consumption, all these sorts of things. So there's the final issue I think with comes down to infrastructure. So a lot of these visions, these strategies are about kind of thinking about the upstream. It's about thinking about the downstream. It's thinking about how what we can simply do is change the inputs and the downstream will sort itself out, and we don't have to think and we don't have to think about the upstream at all because we're just changing inputs. But actually, if we change the upstream, change the source of our inputs, there are significant issues that we need to address as well. So when it comes to something like biomass, for example, biomass is generally bulky. Plant material, trees, all these sorts of things are generally bulky. So we can cut things down, move them to a central location, process them, densify them, but they still have a bulk. They're still bulkier. So actually, if they're bulkier, they're more dense. They're lower. They have a lower energy density than oil, and they're bulkier. There's a chance that if we wanted to transition to this bioeconomy, we would need to actually extend the road network. We would need to extend haulage, all these sorts of things in order to shift all these biological materials around. Now, I don't really want to end on a kind of negative note, although what I've said is might come across as being fairly negative. I think we can be optimistic about something like the bioeconomy. There's a vision there of something that that we could, you know, it represents something, a way of changing the world, changing our economies, essentially, and our worlds. I think we can be positive about it and engage with it as a concept in a kind of challenging way, but at the same time, will not be totally negative and totally dismissive. I think there is something there that I'd like to be optimistic about. I don't know whether I'm being, you know, starry-eyed or not, or I've been turned by the propaganda or not, I don't know, but I'd like to think that there's something that we can build on, if you like. As long as we're not simply repeating the kind of, I guess, platitudes and so on of government, of private sector, and various kinds of folk that promote it. So that's the end of my presentation, which I hope wasn't too esoteric and too far out. Thanks.